The man who handed her the rifle scope didn't say a word. He set it on the table, looked at her like she was someone's assistant who had wandered into the wrong room, and walked out. That was her first morning at Fort Garreth. Her name was Sable Wren. She was 29 years old, 5'6", and had spent the last 4 years as a ballistics analyst embedded with the 75th Ranger Regiment in a civilian advisory capacity, which meant she did the math that kept other people alive, and nobody remembered her name when the mission was over. She had a degree in applied mathematics from Georgia Tech and a secondary certification in long-range marksmanship that she had earned on her own time, with her own money, at a range outside Savannah where the owner had initially refused to teach her because he assumed she had wandered in to ask about a gift certificate. She had not wandered in for a gift certificate. She had come to Fort Garreth because a new program called CAS, Combined Arms Sniper Support, was being piloted, and someone in the Army's training division had decided they needed a civilian analyst who could also shoot. The theory was sound. A spotter who could calculate ballistic drift, wind shear, humidity coefficient, and gravitational variables in real time, and then pick up the rifle herself if the situation demanded it, was worth more than 2 separate specialists, in theory. In practice, the men running the CAS program at Fort Garreth had not been consulted about the decision, and they did not like it. The program director was a man named Colonel Harlan Vose. He was 53 years old, had 28 years of infantry experience, and had built CAS from scratch over 18 months of political infighting and budget negotiations. He was proud of it. He was also, as Sable would come to understand, profoundly uncomfortable with the idea that someone outside his chain of command, someone without a uniform, without a rank, without what he privately called skin in the game, was being inserted into his program by people who sat behind desks in Washington. He did not say this directly. He said it through silence, through logistics. Her access badge took 4 days to be processed instead of the standard one. Her range time was scheduled at 0530, before any of the other participants arrived. Her equipment requests went into a queue that seemed to have no bottom. When she submitted her initial ballistics assessment for the program's core curriculum, 27 pages, single-spaced, with annotated data tables, it came back to her inbox 2 weeks later with a single comment in the margin. Noted, his second-in-command was a man named Major Garrett Finch. He was younger than Vose, louder, and less subtle. On her 3rd day, Finch stopped her in the corridor outside the armory and asked, in front of 4 other personnel, whether she needed someone to explain to her how a rifle worked. She said no. He said, "You sure? Because this isn't a classroom. The guys in this program have 8, 10, 12 years of field experience. They're not going to slow down for someone who learned to shoot on a weekend course." She said, "I didn't learn to shoot on a weekend course." He said, "Whatever you did, it wasn't this." He walked away. The 4 other personnel found things to look at on the floor. Her name among the program participants quickly became the Analyst. Not as a title, as a way of marking distance. The Analyst doesn't have a clearance for that range. The Analyst's paperwork isn't through yet. Does the Analyst even know what a firing solution is? She heard all of it. She let it accumulate the way weather accumulates, steadily, without drama, until the conditions were right. What they didn't know about Sable Wren was this. She had grown up in rural Montana, the daughter of a man who hunted elk at ranges that other hunters considered absurd, and who had, by the time she was 12, handed her a .308 and told her the wind was coming from the northeast at 11 miles per hour and the target was at 847 yards, and what did she think the drop was going to be? She had done the arithmetic in her head. She had been close enough that he had looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before and said, "Do it again." She did it again. By the time she was 16, she was shooting at ranges her father's hunting partners refused to believe until they watched her. By the time she was 20, she had stopped being surprised by the disbelief. It had a disbelief, then the watching, then the silence afterward. She had lived inside that rhythm so many times that it had become almost comfortable. Fort Garreth was just the rhythm again, just longer. The CAS program had 12 active participants. All of them were experienced. 3 had previous sniper school qualifications. 1, a sergeant named Eric Dunmore, had a confirmed long-range engagement from his second deployment that had been written up in a training manual. They were, by every formal measure, exactly what the program was supposed to be building on. They were good. Sable understood that. She did not underestimate them. She simply waited. The first evaluation came in week 3. It was a standard ballistics problem set. 15 scenarios, varying ranges, varying atmospheric conditions, requiring written firing solutions before live engagement. The test was timed. Participants had 45 minutes. Sable finished in 22 minutes. She checked her work twice, and then sat with her hands in her lap until the timer ran. She scored 100%. The second highest score was 84% from Dunmore. Finch, who reviewed the scores, did not comment on hers. He posted the results on the board, with every name listed in order. Sable's name was at the top. He put the marker down and walked out of the room. Nobody said anything directly to her, but the temperature changed. She noticed it the way you notice a shift in pressure before a storm, not in what people said, but in how they stopped saying things. Conversations didn't end when she walked in. They just redirected. Men who had been ignoring her began watching her instead. Dunmore, to his credit, gave her a single nod in the hallway that afternoon. It wasn't warm, but it was honest. The problem that followed was not Sable's performance. The problem was Finch. He began adjusting her range assignments after the evaluation results. Where she had been scheduled for 0530, she was now pushed to 0445. Where the other participants received their atmospheric data packages the morning of their live fire sessions, Sable's packages arrived the evening before, with different data than what she would encounter on the range the following day. She didn't know this initially. She ran her calculations on the numbers she'd been given, arrived at the range, and found that the wind readings were off by enough to matter at the ranges they were shooting. She noted it. She adjusted in real time. She shot well. But the second time it happened, she kept both data sets. She compared them. The discrepancy was not random. She didn't go to VOS. She had no evidence that VOS had authorized it, and she had learned, over years of working in environments where she was the outsider, that accusations without precision were just noise. She needed something cleaner. So she kept the data sets. She kept her scores, and she kept showing up. The live fire qualification came at the end of week 5. It was the program's central evaluation, the one that would determine which participants continued to the advanced track and which were redirected to supporting roles. The course involved engagements at 4 distances: 600 yards, 800 yards, 1,400 yards, and 4,400 yards. Atmospheric conditions were desert profile, high temperature, low humidity, variable crosswind. The crosswind was the variable. It came from the northwest in gusts that were irregular enough that a shooter couldn't rhythm them. You had to read them, calculate them, and decide. Most of the participants shot the 600 and 800 well. The 100 separated the field. Of 12 shooters, 6 hit the required accuracy threshold. Dunmore hit it cleanly. 2 others were close enough to pass. The remaining 3 were below standard. Then feet 400 yards. At feet 400 yards, the math becomes a different kind of problem. It isn't just distance. It's time. The time the bullet spends in the air, during which the wind is doing what it wants to do, during which the target may have shifted by the width of a human body, during which the shooter's own heartbeat and breath, and the microvibrations of the earth itself are all participating in the outcome. At 400 yards, the margin between a hit and a miss is measured in fractions that most people can't think about clearly because most people are thinking about the shot. Sable didn't think about the shot. She thought about the math, and then she let the shot happen. She went last. Finch had arranged the order. She understood why. He wanted her to watch the others struggle, wanted her to feel the weight of the distance before she lay down behind the rifle. What he didn't understand was that she had been shooting at 400 yards since she was 23 years old, and the weight of the distance was something she had made peace with a long time ago. She calculated the wind, not the average wind, but the wind in the corridor between her position and the target, which behaved differently at the 400-yard mark than at the 900-yard mark because of the topography of the range. She had walked the range the day before. She had looked at the terrain the way her father had taught her to look at terrain, not as background but as participant. She fired 3 rounds. The course required 2 hits at the threshold. All 3 rounds were within the standard. The third round was inside the first 2. The range officer called the result. He said it twice because the first time the radio operator didn't respond. He was looking through the spotting scope. Finch said nothing. Vos, who had come out to observe the final evaluation, stood with his arms crossed and watched her walk back from the firing line. His expression did not change, but he was still watching when she reached the staging area and began breaking down her equipment. Most of the observers had already turned away. That evening, Sable submitted a formal report to the program's oversight liaison in Washington. Not to Vos, not to Finch. To the liaison, the report contained her ballistics performance data across the 5-week period, her original atmospheric data packages, and the actual atmospheric readings from each range session. The discrepancies were documented with timestamps. She did not characterize them as intentional. She simply presented them side by side and let the numbers say what numbers say. She then went to the mess hall and ate dinner alone at a table near the window and watched the light go out of the sky over the training ranges. She was not angry. That was the thing that would have been hardest to explain to anyone who asked. She was not angry. Anger requires surprise, and she had not been surprised. She had been managing this specific situation in various forms for the entirety of her adult life. The forms changed. The arithmetic didn't. What she felt, if she was being precise about it, was tired. Not the tired of defeat. The tired of having to spend so much energy on something that should not have required any energy at all. The simple fact of being allowed to do her job. The response from Washington came in 9 days. Sable was in the middle of her morning run when her phone buzzed with a message from the oversight liaison. She stopped at the edge of the training road and read it. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and finished her run. Major Finch was removed from the CAS program and reassigned. The language of the reassignment was formal and said nothing specific, which was the way these things were always done when someone in a position of authority had used that position badly and the institution needed to correct it without appearing to correct it. Sable understood this. She did not require it to be louder. The outcome was what mattered. Vos called her into his office 2 days after Finch's departure. He sat behind his desk and she sat across from it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then he said, "I reviewed the data you submitted." She said, "I know." He said, "I didn't authorize the package discrepancies." She said, "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment. He was the kind of man who had spent 30 years being right about most things and who found it genuinely difficult to be in a room with someone who had outperformed his assumptions. She did not make it easier for him. She didn't need to. He said, "The new 1,400-yard data is going into the program's performance record. Your name is on it." She said, "Okay." He said, "I'm recommending you for the advanced track." She said, "Okay." He looked at her as if he had expected her to say something else, something more, a moment of gratitude or relief, or the softening that people sometimes showed when an institution finally acknowledged them. She didn't show it. Not because she wasn't grateful. She was in the way you are grateful when a process works the way it's supposed to work. But she had learned a long time ago that gratitude directed at people who had simply stopped getting in your way was a kind of diminishment she didn't need to perform. She stood up, thanked him for his time, and left. Dunmore caught up with her outside the building. He was still in his training gear from the morning session. He fell into step beside her, and they walked in the same direction for a few seconds before he said anything. He said, "The third round at 15,400. What was your hold?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment, doing the math. Then he said, "That's right," she said. "I know." He said, "I've been shooting for 12 years. She said, "I know." He said, "Where did you learn to do that?" She thought about her father, about the elk range in Montana, about the days when the light came in low and cold across the high grass, and he would hand her the rifle and say nothing, and she would settle in behind it and find the stillness that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with the moment before the math becomes the shot. She said, "Montana." He nodded like that explained something. Maybe it did. The advanced track began the following Monday. There were 6 participants. Sable was the only civilian. On the first morning, the range officer handed out the atmospheric data packages, and she checked hers against the weather station readings on her phone, and they matched exactly. She folded the package and put it in her vest pocket. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have been a thing at all. But she noticed it, and she was glad. The work itself was what she had always wanted. Problems at the edge of what calculation could reliably solve, where experience and instinct and the willingness to make a decision and commit to it were the only things that carried you over the line. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference now was that there were 5 other people in the room who could see it and who were beginning, slowly and without anyone announcing it, to treat her like someone who belonged there. Dunmore, one afternoon, asked her to look over his firing solution for a fiend 600-yard problem set they'd been given. She looked at it. She found 2 places where his wind calculations diverged from what the atmospheric data actually suggested. She showed him, quietly, without making it a performance. He looked at the correction for a long time. Then he said, "Okay, yeah." And he changed it. That was the beginning of something. Not friendship exactly, not yet, and maybe not ever, in the way that word usually worked. But something honest, something built on the only currency that had ever made sense to her, which was the work itself and how well you did it when it mattered. There were still days when she felt the old weight of it, the sideways glances from visiting personnel who hadn't been told what she'd done, the moment of recalibration she could see happening behind people's eyes when they realized she was part of the program and not someone's assistant. She didn't resent it. She had stopped resenting it years ago. Resentment was expensive, and she had better uses for the energy. What she held on to instead was something harder to name. A kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with what anyone else thought of her and everything to do with what she knew. She knew the math. She knew the wind. She knew what a rifle felt like when it was perfectly still and the world was waiting, and the only thing standing between the calculation and the outcome was her willingness to trust both. In Montana, her father had told her once that the best shooters weren't the ones who were fearless. They were the ones who had found something they trusted more than their fear. He had been talking about the shot, but she had understood, even then, that he was talking about something bigger than that. She understood it more clearly now. On a Thursday evening in the 5th week of the advanced track, Sable sat on the steps outside the bunkhouse and watched the sun go down behind the training ranges. The air was cooling fast. The high desert lost its heat quickly once the light was gone. She had her notebook in her lap, paper, not digital, the same kind she'd been using since college, and she was working through the ballistics problem they'd been given for the next morning's session. It was a moving target problem. It required her to calculate not just distance and atmosphere, but the rate and direction of movement, the geometry of interception, the moment when the math and the physical world aligned. She worked through it slowly, without hurrying, the way she had always worked through problems that deserved to be taken seriously. When she was done, she closed the notebook and looked at the ranges in the dimming light. Tomorrow she would lie down behind the rifle, and the math would become real, and the world would either confirm her work or it wouldn't. That was what she had always loved about this. The way the calculation eventually had to meet the moment. No abstractions, no approximations. You were right or you weren't. She had always been right more often than anyone expected. She expected that would continue.